Hi, welcome back to Critical Thinking. We have finally arrived at our last group of informal fallacies, which is the large category of presumption fallacies. We've worked through ambiguity fallacies, we've worked through relevance fallacies, and we're finally on to that last of the three big categories. And like when we handled the relevance fallacies, I'm going to be breaking the different fallacies down into short videos by subcategory. So today we're going to be taking a look at really what's going to be an introduction. So why don't we go ahead and dive into our first video on the informal fallacies of presumption. Now, as I handled the other videos, I'm going to start by just walking through first a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to be taking a look at in this video. So we're going to break down what we mean by fallacies of presumption, and then I'm going to go ahead and give you some of the specific fallacies by subcategory. So first, the fallacies of presumption. These are the types of fallacies that occur when an argument presupposes something without good reason or without sufficient evidence. The conclusion of the argument relies upon an assumption that really hasn't been supported yet. Now, there are regular fallacies of presumption and there are fallacies of presumption that are specifically concerned with faulty assumptions in scientific or inductive reasoning. So we're going to be breaking things down into those two large subcategories. And if you don't know what induction is, we are going to be spending a number of sessions on that a little bit later. But for now, induction is just a process of observing evidence to construct a probable conclusion or explanation. So let's start by looking at the first category. And here, I'm just going to give an overview of the general subdivisions, as I said, and the particular fallacies within. And again, I won't read all the names since we're going to be looking at each one in turn. But we have 7 general fallacies classified as stacking the deck fallacies, and those are going to be the ones that we're going to look at in this video. The second group are going to be the 5 that we classify as oversimplification or reduction fallacies. The third group, we have 6 unjustified assumptions, and I know that's basically what all these could be named since we're talking about presumption fallacies. The fourth group, we'll be moving on to inductive reasoning. And here we're going to have 3 generalization fallacies and 3 reduction fallacies. And then we're going to save our last video for the final category of induction fallacies, and we're going to be looking at 4 that involve what we call missing evidence. So let's start by taking a look at the general fallacies. And again, all of these involve presupposing something without sufficient evidence. The conclusion of an argument relies on some kind of unproven or questionable assumption. Remember, in any argument, the conclusion relies on its premises. Here, we're going to be dealing with the premises being questionable in and of themselves. And the ones we're going to look at in this session, remember, have nothing to do with inductive reasoning. Part 1, let's deal with the stacking the deck fallacies. First, let's define what we mean by stacking the deck. It's an attempt to bias an argument in favor of your own conclusion. And it involves a hidden assumption that slants an argument in a particular direction. So the first one is going to be one that we call the petitio principii, which means postulation of the beginning. Now that might be a fancy Latin name that you're not going to remember, but there are lots of other titles we can use like begging the question, circular reasoning, tautology, assuming the answer. Some of those actually might already be familiar with you. Very commonly this is called begging the question or circular reasoning, and you can think of it as the arguer begging his audience to accept his position on whatever matter is in question. In other words, assuming what you're trying to prove. That's why we call it circular. You start and end in the exact same place. The conclusion is smuggled into the very evidence that's supposed to provide the reason for the conclusion. If you assume the conclusion in order to prove the conclusion, this is what you're doing. The conclusion might be a restatement of a premise, or in a chain of arguments, the conclusion of the final argument might be the premise of the first, or a premise may use language or terms that simply imply what's being asserted in the conclusion. Any of those would count as begging the question. Now, one note. We tend to use this phrase very often and very incorrectly. The media does this, people do this in general. When you use the phrase to beg the question or that begs the question, we usually mean something like that prompts or raises a further question. And that's not how the phrase is used in academic philosophy. Additionally, we could talk about circular reasoning being technically valid or deductively valid. If all premises are true, then trivially so is the conclusion. And if you've ever heard of the law of identity, which you should remember, because I'm pretty sure we went over the laws of logic some time ago, A implies A. So we think of circular arguments as informally fallacious because they're actually ineffective in proving their conclusions. They may be trivially deductively valid, but they're ineffective in a practical way. We could illustrate it this way. You start with a premise that's shaky, questionable, and then you move on to your conclusion. Now, the whole idea is if the conclusion is what you need to prove and you haven't proved your premise, nobody's going to buy your conclusion. You could also illustrate it a couple different ways. Maybe the shaky premise moves on to a conclusion, which is just a restatement of that premise. Or in a chain of arguments, we could start with that shaky premise and move to one conclusion, a second conclusion, a third conclusion, or however far down you go. And your final conclusion is somehow a restatement of the shaky premise that you started with in the first place. So let's take a look at some examples of begging the question. Many critically ill people are unable to commit suicide by themselves, so clearly they have a right to doctor-assisted suicide. Because the Quran is the transcribed word of God, everything it says is true. It says that Muhammad is the spokesman of God, so what he says is true. And since everything he says is true, the Quran must be the transcribed word of God. And you may have actually heard similar arguments made for the believability of the Bible. It's not an uncommon argument. Capital punishment is wrong because it's wrong for the government to take life. I know philosophers are intelligent people because if they weren't, they wouldn't be philosophers. The doctor's testimony shows that this psychopath was not in his right mind when he committed the murder, so you have no choice but to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. Obviously, something can come from nothing because the universe popped into existence from nothing. We know that macroevolution is true because if animals and humans have anatomical similarities, then they must be biologically related. Well, animals and humans do have anatomical similarities, so they must be biologically related. Now here, the premise assumes an evolutionary relationship. Evolution is supposed to explain the similarities, and the similarities are used as proof of evolution, but it's impossible to demonstrate the question in the premise, that the similarities prove relationship. That's why this becomes circular, or begging the question. The second fallacy we'll call the complex or loaded question. The complex question assumes a second question has already been answered, and it involves formulating a question in a way that presupposes an answer has been given to some unstated but implied question. And the fallacy results when the answer provides a basis for a conclusion to the assumed question, the hidden question, or the answer to the assumed question is false. Now, we also call it a loaded question because the question is loaded with assumptions. The question contains actually more than one question. The loaded question may place the person answering it in a bad light, and the question might be worded in a way that also includes a statement designed to persuade the audience. And very often the question will be phrased, not always, but very often, as a yes or no question. Well, the problem is it can't be answered with a simple yes or no. Now, if we were going to illustrate the fallacy, we could say that the arguer attempts to set a trap by asking a question to the reader or the listener, and the reader or listener is going to respond in such a way that completes the argument for the arguer. All right, let's take a look at some examples here, and we're going to start with an example that is really the standard cliche example. Did you stop beating your wife? Right? No matter how you answer that, yes, then you've admitted to beating your wife in the past. If you say no, then you admitted to still beating your wife. Either way, you lose. Same thing, other direction. Have you stopped cheating on your husband? Which Italian explorer convinced everybody that the world was not flat? Now here you've got a question that is not a simple yes or no type of an answer. You can actually give a name, but there is an assumption in here because you assume that everybody in the world believed the earth was flat, which was actually not the case at the time Columbus sailed, and of course it might be the name Columbus that you're thinking of automatically. Either way, this is a complex question of a different sort. Mr. President, how many more of our children will you send to die for oil? Do you support the oppressive tax code that robs hardworking people of their fairly earned money? So, because of 9/11, you now support America's crusade against the religion of Islam and the slaughter of innocent Muslims around the world? In our last example, the prosecutor says, a simple yes or no. Do you still have the gun that you used to murder the victim? Of course, it's very useful for the attorneys to be able to restrict somebody's answers to simple yes or no's when you're going to try to give them loaded or complex questions. The next one is a loaded definition, which involves giving an unjustified definition of a term in order to favor one position and exclude other possible positions. The definition assumes the conclusion that you're trying to prove. And it could be too broad, it could be too narrow or vague. A poor definition, right, can blur important distinctions. For example, there's a difference between murder and killing, but sometimes people simply conflate those two. Or rhetorical definitions. We've looked at those in the past. That's one that elicits an emotional response or begins to influence opinions in that way. Some examples of loaded definitions might be these. The physical universe is the only thing that exists. Since God would have to be a being that is outside the universe, God cannot exist. Here the definition is built into what we mean by the physical universe. Marriage is simply the union of people that are in love. So if a group of people are in love, then they should also be allowed to marry. A Christian is somebody that believes we should follow the teachings of Jesus, and since Muslims believe that we should follow the teachings of Isa, Jesus, then they must be Christians too. Or murder is the killing of innocent life. So it's murder when you kill and eat animals. Now in that last one, you can see how the definition is far, far too broad. In fact, it would actually imply that you're a murderer even if you're a vegetarian. So even if a vegetarian is using this particular definition, then it would backfire on them. Cuts both ways. The laws of nature cannot be broken, and the supernatural is something that violates the laws of nature, so the supernatural cannot exist. If all murder is wrong, then why do you support capital punishment, which is government-sanctioned murder? And our last example, racism. The belief in the superiority of one race over another, which results in discrimination and prejudice towards people because of their race or ethnicity, combined with the power to discriminate against those thought to be inferior through systemic means. Our fourth fallacy is special pleading or suppressed evidence, which is an attempt to prevent the opposing viewpoint from being considered. And this can be done in a couple different ways. By applying select rules or criteria or principles to an opponent's argument or policy that you're not applying to your own, or by presenting only the evidence that supports your position. That's the one that's really called the suppressed evidence variation. It's when we hold our opponent's argument or actions to higher or different standards. Now, it's normal for people to be skeptical of evidence that supports a view different from their own, but to accept uncritically evidence that seems to support their own position. And you should remember this from when we talked about confirmation bias in our second or third video. That's exactly what confirmation bias is. An argument using special pleading could be formulated this way or structured this way. They start with a general rule: all X's are Y, Joe is an X, but Joe is an exception to the rule because Joe is an I, and here I could stand for any kind of irrelevant characteristic. Therefore, Joe is not a Y. That would be an example of special pleading, and we can illustrate or to schematize it this way. You start with a premise that ignores stronger evidence that supports a different conclusion, and then just go ahead and move right on to your conclusion. Or we could start with my argument side by side with your argument. Both of these arguments lead to their respective conclusions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some kind of exception or different standard for your argument so that you won't reach your conclusion and I will, which means I win. Some examples of this: there is no absolute truth, only relative truth. Whoever makes this assertion is clearly not applying this very rule to his own assertion, but only to other people's assertions. It's what we call a self-defeating type of statement. This car is a good deal. It gets 25 miles to the gallon, only has 4,000 miles on it, it's still under warranty, and costs only $13,999. Now, what isn't mentioned might be that the price is maybe $1,500 over market value. The lot across the street might have a comparable model that gets better gas mileage, costs less. Maybe the transmission slips. Maybe it has aftermarket parts that avoid the warranty. You know, it's not really in the salesman's interest to share this information with you. So again, you could see a lot of salesmen maybe committing a fallacy like special pleading, but it's not something we wouldn't understand. I bet the Democratic politician really did cheat on his wife. Why would people lie about that? But I find it hard to believe that the Republican politician cheated on his. He was probably framed. There's no way that all ethnic diversity could be tracked back to some original human couple. But I do believe that all biological life is related to one original single cellular organism. Let's take a look at a video clip that illustrates this as well.
that Kamala Harris said that this facility, putting people in this facility, was a human rights abuse committed by the United States government, and Joe Biden said, under Trump, there have been horrifying scenes of at the border of kids being kept in cages. Now it's not under Trump; it's under Biden.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities. It is not a replication, certainly not. That is never our intention of replicating the immigration policies of the past administration, but we are in a circumstance.
And I think in this clip you could actually see the distinction without a difference that we also previously studied. Now, our fifth fallacy, stacking the deck, is when one side declares the winner of an argument to be whoever is capable of meeting my select standards. Or I'm going to guarantee myself victory because the standards I set are the ones that I know I can meet, but my opponent can't meet. One simply disregards any other test for truth apart from their own. It's very similar to special pleading, and sometimes the two names are used interchangeably. So to distinguish them here, special pleading uses a different standard to judge each argument, and stacking the deck uses the same standard, but one that only one of the arguments is going to be able to meet. Again, two arguments side by side, my argument side by side with your argument. This time we have select standards that are applied to both, but only my argument is going to be able to meet those standards. Therefore, my conclusion is the one we have to come to. Let's take a look at some examples of this. Superman is a better hero than Batman. Batman can't fly without a machine. Basketball players are better athletes than soccer players. How many points do soccer players score in comparison to basketball players in a single game? If you can't show me God or tell me how God created the universe, then there's no good reason to believe that God exists. The sixth fallacy is going to be called the no true Scotsman. You may have heard of this one as well. The act of reinterpreting evidence in a way that prevents it from undermining your position, or shielding your generalization from a counterexample by excluding the counterexample ad hoc. Now, the name actually comes from a very famous 20th century philosopher, Anthony Flew, who gave an example of a patriotic Scotsman refusing to believe anything bad about his countrymen. Scotsmen don't murder, so no murderers are true Scotsmen. And again, this is basically the same as special pleading, and if we want to look at it in a particular form, no Scotsman does murder. Connor does murder. Well, Connor isn't a true Scotsman. Or we could just plug in all X are S, C is an X, but C is an M, which is some irrelevant characteristic, so C is not a true S. Let's take a look at some examples of this one. Since Republicans are conservative, that Republican senator who voted with the Democrats is clearly a rhino. Or, socialism has resulted in widespread poverty in many places it's been implemented. If you're referring to places like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or Venezuela, well, those weren't true socialist governments. And here's another video clip that might illustrate this as well.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
And our seventh fallacy is the slippery slope, or the domino fallacy. A slippery slope argument is based on the assumption that something should not be done or believed because of where it might lead, right? Some kind of negative outcome. The argument's concerned with a chain of causes. A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, like a chain of dominoes. That's why it's also called the domino theory. Now, this kind of reasoning says reject A because it's going to lead you to D. And B might not be too bad, but things are going to become progressively worse as you go down the chain. The problem with the slippery slope argument is the argument asserts some kind of necessary consequence for adopting the starting point. If you accept the first claim, a subsequent series of things will inevitably follow. Now, that's not always the case. Some types of arguments are effective in showing where consequences will follow or should follow or probably will follow from a starting point. Those wouldn't be necessarily slippery slope fallacies, but the key to catching the fallacy is, number one, to determine if the implications or causal relationships are real. And if they are, the argument might actually be valid or strong. You have to discern if the connection is logical or only psychological. Some statements actually do lead to conclusions by logical necessity, but some only sound persuasive. If you wanted to illustrate it, it might look like this. You start with innocent first step A, which implies possibly B, which possibly implies C or D. Remember, there's a question at each of these stages. And then on we go, finally, till we get to the disaster at the very end, E. Here is a clip that's worth watching. And as with many of the fallacies that we've covered, it can be used for both humor and advertising, and I think this one does both really well. You may be familiar with this series of commercials that are a little bit dated now, but they were really popular once upon a time.
When you pay too much for cable, you feel powerless. When you feel powerless, you want to take the power back. When you want to take the power back, you take karate. When you take karate, you want to use your karate. When you want to use your karate, you become the fist of goodness. When you become the fist of goodness, you run along rooftops. And when you run along rooftops, you fall into a dinner party. Don't fall into a dinner party. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV.
That was a great series of commercials, if you ask me, but they're all based on that idea of a slippery slope fallacy. So let's go ahead and take a look at some other examples of this. Drinking alcohol is wrong because it leads people to start smoking marijuana, which leads people to get addicted to crack, which leads to suicide and prostitution. So, don't drink alcohol. If it's legal for the government to read our emails, this will lead to the erosion of other civil rights, such as the right to bear arms, and then our country will become like Nazi Germany. If you listen to that music, you'll start to act out the lyrics. Playing those video games will make you want to start killing people in real life. And if we stimulate the Chinese economy through foreign aid, we will one day have to fight them. Now that pretty much wraps up this first video on informal fallacies of presumption. Next time we're going to be moving on to part 2, where we're going to be covering the oversimplification subcategory. So stick around because we've got a lot more to go. This is just, again, scratching the surface of the presumption fallacies. We have really, I think now 4 more videos where we're going to be continuing this discussion. So until then, take care and I'll see you in the next video.